Hey there, how's it going everyone? In this video, we're going to be showing how to build a simple REST API using Flask and Marshmallow. So with me here, I have my Visual Studio Code open. I'm going to be using PostgreSQL as my database, and I'm going to use Insomnia as my testing tool for the API. So to get started, I'll first create the virtual environment. So to do that, I'm going to type Python -m, then I'm going to save them, then call my virtual environment env. So this is going to create a virtual environment within our folder. Now once this is done, the next step will be to activate the virtual environment. So once this is done, I'm going to activate the virtual environment by saying source env scripts and activate. This is going to activate our virtual environment. Now once our virtual environment has been activated, the next thing is going to be to install the packages that are required for our project. So I'm going to install Flask and Flask SQLAlchemy, because that's what we use as our ORM. I'm also going to install Marshmallow, since it's what we're going to use for our object serialization. And I'm also going to install the database driver for PostgreSQL. I'm going to install the binary and then install. This is going to fetch these packages and install them within our virtual environment. Wait till these packages are finished installing. So once these packages are finished installing, the next thing is going to be to create our requirements.txt file. So I'm going to pip freeze the requirements to requirements.txt. This is going to create our requirements.txt file with all the necessary requirements. So when I open this file, we see that all our packages have been installed. Then the next thing is going to be to set up our Flask server. So I'm going to create a file which I'm going to call app.py. And within app.py, I'm going to create the Flask instance. So I'm going to say from Flask, I'm going to import Flask, and I'm going to create the app instance. So app is equal to Flask, and then we pass in the import name, which is name. Now after passing in the import name, the next thing is going to be to create a route. So since we're going to create an API, let's create a test route. So I'm going to call this a test route. So this is going to be slash. I'm going to define its view function. So let me just call it hello. Once I do that, I'm going to just return hello world. And let me save this. So I'm going to run our server by saying if name is equal to main. I'm going to run the app by saying app.run. Since we are developing, I'm going to say debug is going to be equal to true. And once this is done, I'm going to save and run the server. So I'm going to come, say Python app.py within our virtual environment. And this is going to start our app. So if I be able to make a request to that endpoint, so I'm going to come and create another request. These are the other routes that we're going to implement. So I'm going to just create this. Let me just call it dummy request just to test if our server is returning correct responses. So I'm going to send this to localhost 5000. When I send this, it's going to return hello world as the response. Now the next thing is going to be to set up our database. So right now I have pgadmin, which is the GUI tool for Postgres. And I'm going to create a database. So I open up my pgadmin and create a database here. So I'm going to say create. I'm going to create the database. Now this database is being created, so I'm going to give it a name. Let me call it recipes. And I'm going to give it the owner. So the owner of this is going to be Postgres. And then I'm going to save. This database is going to be created for us, and it's what we're going to use for our API. Now once our database has been created, the next thing is going to be to create our database model. So I'm going to use SQLAlchemy for that. So remember, I installed SQLAlchemy within our requirements, so it's here, which is going to act as our ORM. It's going to help us to create objects that will help us to model our database. So let me create our model. So to do that, I'm going to say from Flask SQLAlchemy import SQLAlchemy. So once I do that, I'm going to create the DB instance. I'm going to create the instance of SQLAlchemy by saying SQLAlchemy is equal to app. Now when I save this, we are going to notice that some errors have been occurred. Errors like SQLAlchemy database URI has not been set. So let's set that. I'm going to do that slightly above the SQLAlchemy instance. So I'm going to say app.config, and this is going to be SQLAlchemy database URI. It's going to be, now we're going to pass in the connection string to our SQL database. So in this case, we're using PostgreSQL, and we are going to name the name of the database we're going to use is called recipes. So we are going to write PostgreSQL, and we write the connection string as, so we're going to write the name of our database user, who is Postgres, and the password of that user. So I'm going to write the password is this password, and once I write this password, I'm also going to write the host, so which is localhost. Let me change this. So this is going to be localhost, and then slash the database. So this is going to be the database, which is recipes. So when I save this, we are going to see that another error is being shown, which is our SQLAlchemy track modifications. So I'm also going to set that to false. I'm going to say app.config. This is going to be SQLAlchemy track modifications, and this is going to be equal to false. I'm going to save, and you see that now our server is showing no errors. So once that is done, the next thing is going to be to create our model. So our model is going to be showing the way our database is going to be. So our recipe is going to have a name, a description, going to have a name and a description, and it will also have a unique ID, which is going to be the unique identifier for each recipe in our database. So to create our model, I'm going to create a class. So this class is going to be called recipe, and this class is going to inherit from SQLAlchemy.model. So I'm going to say db.model. Now once I do this, I'm going to attach the ID, which is going to be the primary key. So I'm going to say ID is going to be equal to db dot column db. It's going to be an integer, and then it's going to also be the primary key. So we set primary key attribute. Set the primary key attribute to true in this case. And the next thing we need is the name column. So I'm going to say name going to be db dot column, and the next thing is going to be specifying the type. So this case is going to be string. So we're going to say it's going to be a string of characters 255, and we don't want it to be null. So we're going to say null label going to be equal to false for that column. The next thing is going to be to set the description. So the description is going to be text. So we're going to say description going to be equal to db.text, and the db.text, and we are going to actually this is a column. So let's say db.column, and this is going to be db.text. And the next thing I'm going to say is null label is going to be equal to false. Now, for convenience, when querying our database, we shall need methods or what they call managers. But to simplify all that, we are going to create our own methods that are going to help us to query our database. For example, let me first create the first method that's going to help us to return string representation of our objects. So I'm going to do that by creating a function called danda repre. So this is going to take in self, take in the current object, and then it's going to return the name of that recipe. Now the next thing I'm going to do is to write a function that's going to help us to query for all the recipes in the database. So to do that, I'm going to create a class method. So I'm going to call this class method and then create a function. So this is going to be get all. I'm going to call it get all. So it's going to take in that class, and the next thing is going to just return class dot query dot all. Now, query.all is a manager that is that is that helps us to query model classes with SQLAlchemy. And then .all specifies that we need a list of all the instances or all the objects of the recipe class within our database. So this will return all the recipes in our database. Now we also need to create, I'm also going to create another method which I'm going to call class method, and this is going to return one by its ID. So I can call it get by ID, and then I pass in the class and then the ID. So this will return. So we're going to write class dot query dot get. What we want is to get a specific object with that ID and then return 404 not found, and that object is not found. So I'm going to say get 004, get 0404, then we pass in the ID. So this is supposed to look for that object, and if it does not exist, the server will return 404 not found error. Now, once that is done, I'm also going to create methods that are specific to the objects themselves that will help us to delete as well as to commit those changes to the database. So to do that, I'm going to write a method which I'm going to call def, and this is going to be save. So this is going to be saving the instance of the object in this case. Now, I'm going to be using db.session. So we're going to add it to the session first. Then this is going to be db.session.add. Then this is going to add the current object, which is self. And then we shall finally commit it to the database by saying db.session.commit. And what this method is going to do is to get that object that we shall create out of this class and add it to the SQLAlchemy session as well as to save it to the database. So the next thing is going to be a method that's going to help us to be convenient when deleting these recipe objects. So I'm going to create that method and I'm going to call it delete. And it's going to take in the current object, which is going to be self. Now, when it takes in self, the next thing we're going to do is to add it to the SQLAlchemy session. So we're going to say db.session. Actually, this is going to be calling the delete method. Then we specify the object. So the object is going to be the, the current object, which is self. And then we finally commit the changes to database by saying db.session.commit. Now, after doing this, the next thing we're going to do is to create a serializer class. Now remember, we're using Marshmallow in this video. Marshmallow helps us to serialize these objects and turn them to data that you can be able to receive as JSON. I'm going to import Marshmallow and also create a serializer class from Marshmallow, so which is going to be a schema. So I'm going to come to the top of the code, then I say from Marshmallow, I'm going to import the schema and then the fields. Now these fields help us to specify the different fields that we have for our class that we want to serialize. For example, we can serialize the ID field and the name field and the description. And the schema is what helps us to act as a model for which we're going to serialize our database model. So let's try to do this. So I'm going to create the class, the serializer class. So I'm going to create a class which I'm going to call the recipe schema. This is going to be the schema from which we're going to serialize our recipe model. And it's going to inherit from schema. Now the next thing is going to be specifying the fields for that class. So we need to specify the ID. The ID is going to be fields. This is going to be an integer. So we're going to say fields dot. This is going to be an integer. And we can also specify the name. The name is going to be fields dot. This is going to be a string. So we're going to specify that it's going to be a string. And we can also say the description is going to be also of type string. So I'm going to say fields dot string. Now once we've created our serializer class, the next thing is we are going to create these CRUD routes that are going to help us to create, read, update, and delete resources and we access them via routes. So let me go to our API, and now we see the different routes that we want to implement. So we're going to create one that helps us to get a list of recipes, create a recipe, update, delete a recipe, and get a recipe by its ID. So let's do this. So you need to come here, and we've set up our server. Now let's first create our database models. Let's migrate them to the database. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to create a simple and okay, see, and we're having an error here. So we are having has no attribute integer. So let me fix this. So we're going to go to our serializer class and we fix this. So this is going to be integer. We're going to save. I run our app again. So our app is now running successfully. So I'm going to stop it for now. And we want to create our database. So I'm going to open Python. I'm going to open the Python interactive console, and once I open that, the next thing is going to be to import the model, our model which is recipe, and I'm also going to import, let me say from app, I'm going to import our recipe class which is our model class. I'm also going to import the SQLAlchemy instance which is DB in this case. So I import them. The next thing is going to be running db dot create all, so that our database table is created. So in a run db.create all, we are saying that there is no password that is supplied. Now we are having a no password supplied, so this means that we didn't specify the password for our PostgreSQL. So let me check this. See that I provided the password, however, so let me try to fix that. So we need to pull up the documentation. So I'm going to say ask SQLAlchemy, say PostgreSQL, and I'm going to look for the SQLAlchemy. Let me actually look for the SQLAlchemy docs. So I'm going to go to the docs, and I look for the connection. So we need to look for the configuration. So connection URI format. And once I go to this, I'm going to look at PostgreSQL // we added 3. So let me remove 1. So when I save this, I'm going to reopen the console. So I'm going to first exit out of it and reopen it with Python. Now when I reopen this console, we are going to create a database. So I'm going to first import the database. So I'm going to say from app import our database model, which is recipe, and then the SQLAlchemy instance, which is DB. When I import this, successfully imported, let's try creating our database by saying db.create all. So this is going to create our database. So I'm going to go back to our PostgreSQL and try to access our database table. So I'm going to go to schemas, and when I go to schemas, I'm going to search for tables. And when we look at our tables, we are having our table created, and now we need to check for the columns. So when I check for columns, I see that we now have our columns created for ID, name, and description. Once that is created, the next thing is going to be to create the different routes that are going to help us to do the CRUD operations on our API. So you need to go to Visual Studio Code and we need to create the first route. So let me delete this dummy route. So let's first create all the routes. So I'm going to say app.route, and this is going to be /recipes, and I'm going to just say def get all recipes. So this is going to be one that works with a get request to get all recipes, and I'm just going to pass it for the moment. Let me even pass in the methods using the first way implementing this. So I'm going to say method is equal to get, and this is going to be pass. Then I'm also going to say at app.route. So we're also going to say recipes, and this in this case is going to be methods is equal to. So this case is going to be post, and we need to create the view function, which is going to be a create a recipe, and it's going to we're also going to pass this for now. Now we're also going to create the one that's going to help us to get one recipe. So I'm going to say app.route. In this case, it's going to be the recipe, and we shall access it by its ID, which is an integer. So I'm going to say int ID. I'm going to say that the method in this case is going to be the get method, since we are getting the recipe. I'm going to create the v function, which is going to be get recipe. Then I pass in the ID within the v function. I'm going to pass. Now I'm also going to create the route that's going to help us to update our recipe. Now this is going to take in the URL, which is going to be recipe /int ID. Actually, realize I did a mistake here, so let me first create it. So I'm going to come this side and also add the methods list. So in this case, the method is going to be because we're going to be updating our recipe. So this is going to be the v function. I'm going to say def update recipe, and it's going to take in the ID of the recipe to update. So we're going to pass this. Now we're also going to create one last route, which is going to be for deleting recipes. So in this case, we're going to pass in app.route. Then we pass in /recipe. It's going to be recipe /int ID. I want to delete a recipe by its ID. So when we pass in methods, the method in this case is going to be delete Once this is done, I'm going to create a v function, which is going to be delete recipe. Once I do this, I'm going to add the ID and then pass. Now, let's implement the different functionalities for creating, reading, and updating and deleting recipe resources from our API. So let me first exit out of this console, and when I run, I'm going to run python app.py. This is going to run our server. Once our server is running, we are going to implement this. So I'm going to begin by implementing the route that gets all the recipes from the database. Our database is empty for now, so let's first query for an empty list or an empty object that returns uh, an empty query set of recipes in our database. So let me do this. So I'm going to come here. I'm going to say recipes is going to be equal to our recipe class. So this is going to be recipes dot. So remember, we created the convenience method that's going to help us to query for all the recipes within our database. So I'm going to go here, and that is get all. We're going to say recipes dot get all. Once we do that, we're going to now create an instance of our serializer class, which is the recipe schema marshmallow. Then we're going to say that okay, let's even call it the serializer. So I'm just going to call it the serializer. In this case, it's going to be the recipe schema, and this schema will create an instance of it. So once we want to return recipe data, we are going to just call the dump method on this recipe schema. So let's try to do that. So I'm going to say data, in this case is going to be let's say it's going to be serializer dot dump. So we're going to call dump. So I'm going to say serializer dot dump, and then we pass in the data we want to serialize. So in this case, it's going to be the recipes data. So I'm going to say recipes. Now, if we want to return JSON, we are going to use the JSONify function that comes with Flask. Now, I'm going to import JSONify from Flask. So I'm going to say from Flask, import Flask, and I'm also going to import JSONify. So we're going to return our HTTP response at JSON. So I'm going to come and say return, and this is going to be return JSONify, and we are going to return the data. So I'm going to just return a JSONify, and we shall remove this, and what we shall return is the data. So let me save this and run. So let's make a request to localhost 5000/recipes and see what we shall get. So I'm going to go to insomnia and get a list of recipes. So I'm going to say localhost, I'm going to add the URL for our request. It's going to be localhost 5000/recipes. When I send a GET request to this, we expect an empty list of recipes. So I'm going to send, and this is going to return a dictionary or an object, a JSON object. And this is because we expected a list, but we never specified that we wanted a list. Now we're going to go back to our code, and what you shall realize is we have our serializer class, but if we just instantiate it and we do not specify that we want a list, it's going to return the data as an object in JSON. So let's specify that we want a list of this data. So I'm going to do this by adding a many is equal to true. When I say many is equal to true, let me change this. It's going to be many is equal to true, and then save. When I save this and I resend the request, we are going to see that it's going to return an empty list of recipes. So let me send, and now this is going to return an empty list of recipes. So let's try to implement a route that's going to create our recipes. So to do that, I'm going to come this side and go to the route, and which is sending the post method. So I'm going to come and say, I'm going to remove the pass, and the first thing we shall do is to get the data from our client as JSON. So I'm going to import the request object from Flask. I'm going to import request. When I import request, I'm going to come down to our route and specify that we want our data as request.get JSON. Now we expect that our client is going to send data in form of JSON, and this method getJSON helps us to get that data as JSON. So once we get that data as JSON, the next thing is going to be to create an object of our model class, which is recipe, this one, and then form an object out of the data we've got as JSON. So to do that, we need to say new recipe is going to be our recipe class, and we then create an instance of that class. So the name attribute of this new object is going to be a data dot get. So in this case, we want to get the name attribute from the JSON, and we want to also get the description, and this description is going to be the description from the JSON. So we're going to say description. Now we expect that this data is going to be sent as the body of the request. That's going to be the post request from our client. So I'm going to change this variable to description, and I'm going to change this to name. Let's check if our model has more fields. We only have name and description, which is good. And the next thing will be to call our convenience method that we created that's going to save this object. So I'm going to say new recipe dot save. This is going to save this instance, and we're also going to call our serializer class, so that is serializes, and returns our object as JSON to show that that request has been successful. So to do that, I'm going to just say serializer, and I'm going to call that recipe schema. So I'm going to create an instance of the recipe schema class. Once I do that, the next thing is going to be to return the data. So our data is going to be the serializer, and we call a dump method on the serializer. We're going to pass in our newly created recipe. So this is going to be the new recipe, and we are going to return a response as JSON. So we're going to use JSONify, and we shall return the data, and we can also specify the method, the HTTP status code that we want on the status being successful. So when you create a resource, we use the 201 created status code. So I'm going to save this, and let's go back to our client. So when I go back to Insomnia, I'm going to go to my create a recipe post post URL. So I'm going to that in. So it's going to be localhost 5000/recipes. Now all we want is the body from this request, so I'm going to specify the body. I'm going to come and specify that we need to add a body, and that body is going to be JSON. So let's specify our body. So I'm going to add the body. What we want is a name, so I specify k as name, then I add a value. Let me call that milk bread. So to test this, I'm also going to add a simple description. So I'm going to say description is going to be, we say make. For now, let's just say make dar add milk. And once we do that, we try to test this out. So I'm going to send, and when I send this, we see that our request has been successful, and it has returned a 201 created status code, which means that the request has succeeded and a new resource has been created, which is good. So let's try to implement the next route. So the next route is going to be the one that returns a simple recipe by its ID. So the first thing we'll need to do is to query the database for that recipe with a certain ID, and then return that object as JSON. So to do that, we created our convenience method. So I'm going to do that by saying recipe going to be calling the recipe class, then what get by ID, then we specify that the ID we want is the one from the view function, and that is going to be ID. So I'm going to return this as JSON. So what I'm going to do is to create the serializer. I'm going to say serializer is going to be the instance of our recipe schema class, and we are going to return our data as the result of serializing that object we've queried. So we're going to say our serializer is going to dump that object, which is going to be our recipe. Once this is done, we are going to return this data as an HTTP response, but it's going to be in form of JSON. So I'm going to use JSONify. I'm going to return JSONify, and I'm going to return the data. Now the status code in this case will be 200. So I'm going to save. Let's try doing this with our client. So I'm going to go back to Insomnia, and in this case we're going to get a recipe by its ID. So I'm going to specify that we want localhost. Let's see the URL, it's recipe/id. So in this case, it's going to be localhost 5000 slash recipe slash, and the ID is going to be 1 in this case. So I'm going to send this, and you see that we've been able to get our resource returned. Let's just implement the remaining routes. So we are going to implement a route that helps us to update the recipe. So I'm going to come to the code, and I'm going to first query for that specific recipe we would like to update. So I'm going to create a variable, and I call it recipe to update. This is going to be recipe dot get my ID, and then I pass in the ID that comes in the view function. So that is going to be ID. And once I do that, we are going to get the data as JSON, the data that you want to update. So we're going to say data is going to be equal to request dot get JSON. And the next thing is to update. So to update, we're just simply going to say recipe to update dot the name. So when we say the name, we want to just set that to the data we get from our client. That is going to be our name. So it's going to be data.get name. And then we're also going to say recipe update dot the description is going to be equal to data dot get description. And when you do this, we are going to simply save these changes to the database. So I'm going to say db.session commit, and this will basically save our updated object in the database. So after doing that, we are going to return this as JSON response. So we're going to create our serializer. So I'm going to say serializer is going to be equal to our recipe schema class, and after doing that, we want to return the data. So we're going to say recipe data. So I'm going to say recipe data is going to be equal to serializer dot dump. In this case, what we want to dump is the recipe to update. So I'm going to say recipe to update, and we're going to return this as JSON. So I'm going to say return JSONify. So when I say JSONify, I'm going to JSONify the recipe data. I'm going to say return JSONify, then it's going to be recipe data, and we want to return a status code of 200. So let's try to test this. So I'm going to save. Our server is going to restart, and when I go to our Insomnia, I'm going to go to that specific route. So let me copy this URL since it's the same for updating. So I'm going to go to update, and then I'm going to paste in the URL, and I have to specify the body, the updated body. So let me first go back to the post. So I'm going to copy this body and go to update. So try to change this. So instead of doing milk bread, let me try saying milk biscuits. So when I send this, we are seeing that our response is returning okay, which means that our object has been updated. Let's try to get it. So I'm going to go to get a recipe by its ID. And when I go to the recipe, I'm going to get it, and we get the milk biscuits, which means that our object has been updated successfully. So let's try to also create that route that deletes. So I'm going to come to delete, and the first thing is going to be to query that recipe we would like to delete. So I'm going to say recipe to delete. It's going to be recipe dot get by ID, and we want to pass in the ID that comes from the view function. Then all we have to do is to say recipe to delete dot delete, since we created a convenience method that's going to delete for us this object. So let's check that out. So I'll go back to our model class. So we have the delete method that takes in that object and then deletes it. So we are going to come here, recipe to delete dot delete, and all we have to do is to return return JSONify, and we want to say that we just want to pass in a message. So we're going to pass in deleted, and since we've deleted this, we are just going to return the message deleted and a status code of 204. So let me save this. Now, after doing this, let's test that route. So I'm going to come here and come and say localhost. So let me try to post in the URL. Let me actually write it into localhost 5000 recipe 1. So when I send this, it's saying no content, which means that that specific object has been deleted and nobody is returned for a response. So let's try to test all the routes that we've created in this video. So when I try to get a list of recipes, so let's try to get a list of recipes. It's going to return an empty list since we do not have any recipe in our database. So let's try to create a recipe. So when I go and create a recipe and send, it's going to create the recipe and return 201 created. So let's try to get a recipes, to get a list recipes. When I send, we see that a list of recipes has been created. Let's try to create other recipes. So I'm going to try to send, send, so that we have many recipes in our database. So when I get a list of recipes, we have a list of recipes up to ID 5, up to ID 6. So let me try to get one recipe by its ID. So if we get recipe 1, it's not found and we are being returned a not found error. So let's try to fix this. Instead of our API returning this not found page, what we want to do is to return a not found error. So basically, Flask helps us to write those error handler view functions. So let's try to do that. So I'm going to say at app dot error handler, and I'll pass in that specific error that you want to catch. So I'm going to say 500, and this is going to be in case we have an internal server error. So we are going to return, so I write internal server error, and in this function, what you want to do is to just return a response that's showing us that we have that 500 error. So what you're going to do is to JSONify, and what you'll pass through is a dictionary containing a message, and that message is going to be there is a problem. So this will be at the server, so a user won't be able to know what's happening. So let's try to also create the not found error. So if I say at app.error handler, I'll pass in 404, then the view function in this case is going to be not found. Then I pass in error. So I'm going to just return JSONify, and I'm going to put in a message, and the message is going to be resource not found. So let's try to save this and we go back to our API. So when I send, you see that our API is returning resource not found. However, the status code is 200. So let's try to fix this. So I'll just add the status code as 404. Let me save. I'll also add the status code here, which is going to be 500. So when I save, I'm going to try to run this, and then we see that we are returning an error code of 404. In this video, we've been able to create a REST API using Flask, Postgres, and Marshmallow. If you feel you've watched this video and learned from it, please leave a like and please subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.